How did Venezuela's economy collapse? Venezuela is a country located on the northern coast of South America. It has the world's largest oil reserves and was once one of the richest countries in Latin America. The country is in the midst of an economic disaster. How did it all go so wrong? Historical context. Venezuela's history has been heavily influenced by its vast oil reserves discovered in 1922. The oil industry quickly became the backbone of the country's economy, accounting for over 90% of its exports and a significant portion of its GDP. In the early 20th century, Venezuela was ruled by a series of dictators, including General Juan Vicente Gómez. Gómez, who ruled from 1908 to 1935, oversaw the growth of the oil industry and used its profits to modernize the country. However, his regime was also marked by political repression and human rights abuses. The oil reserves in the Maracaibo Basin of western Venezuela began producing 100,000 barrels of oil per day. And under the rule of dictator General Gómez, the nation opened its doors to over 100 foreign oil companies. As a result, by 1928, Venezuela became the world's second largest exporter of petroleum. The increase in oil revenues brought significant wealth to the military regime, particularly with the implementation of a 1943 law mandating that foreign oil companies surrender half of their profits. However, the financial gain from the oil industry only served as a temporary solution and failed to address the underlying issues facing the nation. Following Gómez's death, Venezuela underwent a series of political and economic changes. In the 1950s, Marcos Pérez Jiménez came to power and implemented a series of modernization programs, including the construction of new infrastructure and the expansion of the oil industry. However, his regime was also marked by corruption and human rights abuses, and he was eventually overthrown in 1958. Rómulo Betancourt, who served as president from 1959 to 1964, is credited with establishing democracy in Venezuela. He implemented a series of economic and social reforms, including the nationalization of the oil industry. This move helped to increase government revenue and improve living standards for many Venezuelans. In 1973, the OPEC embargo against the US and other countries caused a significant increase in the price of oil, leading to a major boost in revenues for Venezuela. As a result, the country's per capita GDP soared throughout the rest of the decade. In 1975, President Carlos Andrés Pérez took a bold move by nationalizing the oil industry, creating the state-owned company Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA. This move solidified Venezuela's control over its vast oil reserves and allowed the governments to directly benefit from the revenue generated. In the 1970s, Venezuela was one of the wealthiest countries in Latin America. However, the country's dependence on oil exports made it vulnerable to fluctuations in the global market. In 1989, Venezuela was forced to seek an IMF bailout in order to address its economic crisis. The country implemented a series of structural adjustments, including the deregulation of the economy and the privatization of state-owned enterprises. While these measures helped to address some of the country's economic problems, they also led to increased inequality and poverty. The Chavez era. Hugo Chavez rose to power in 1999 after being elected as the president of Venezuela. He campaigned on a platform of socialism and promised to address the social and economic inequalities that plagued the nation. Chavez's rise to power was marked by his charismatic personality and his promises of change. He was able to rally support from the poor and working-class populations who felt neglected by the previous government. Chavez was also able to gain control over the military, which allowed him to consolidate his power. He created a number of social programs, including food and housing subsidies, and established a network of community organizations to provide services to the poor. One of the key drivers to Chavez's socialist policies was a significant increase in oil prices. Between 2000 and 2008, the price of oil per barrel rose from $8 to over $100, providing Venezuela with a massive influx of oil revenues. This allowed Chavez to fund his socialist agenda and make significant investments in social programs, such as housing, education, and healthcare. Chavez and his government misused oil revenues for political gain, making lavish spending on public works projects and political propaganda. In addition, corruption became rampant as high-level officials and businesses siphoned off oil revenues for their own benefit. Chavez's socialist policies also focused more on means rather than production, leading to what some have called socialismo. This term refers to a focus on the symbols and gestures of socialism, rather than substance and results of socialist policies. One of the major failures of Chavez's socialism was the creation of Corpoelec, a state-owned electricity company. Despite massive investments, the company was unable to provide reliable power to the country. This was due to a lack of investment in maintenance and upgrades, as well as widespread corruption. Similarly, Chávez's land reform policies were often marked by expropriation without compensation, leading to a decline in agricultural production and food security. This was compounded by the government's mismanagement of the food distribution system, which resulted in widespread shortages and long lines at grocery stores. Chávez's regime was widely criticized for its authoritarianism and lack of transparency. He was accused of suppressing opposition, limiting freedom of speech, and violating human rights. In addition to the problems caused by Chávez's socialist policies, the country was plagued by economic mismanagement during his time in power. The government's overdependence on oil revenue, failure to diversify the economy, and lack of investment in other industries all contributed to the country's economic decline. The government's spending habits also played a role in the country's economic decline. Despite the increase in oil revenue, the government spent lavishly on social programs, subsidies, and other forms of spending without putting in place the proper infrastructure and management to ensure these programs were sustainable. For Venezuela, 2012 marked the beginning of a devastating national collapse, the worst in modern South American history. The Maduro era. The rise of Nicolas Maduro to power in Venezuela in 2013 marked a continuation of the policies implemented by his predecessor, Hugo Chávez. Venezuela was already facing numerous challenges, including economic mismanagement, widespread corruption, and dependence on oil revenue. But under Maduro's leadership, the situation worsened even further. Maduro continued Chávez's socialist policies, which focused on means rather than production, leading to socialismo and the failure of several government projects. Despite this, he doubled down on these policies, further centralizing power and limiting freedom of the press and speech. The oil-rich nation was suffering from declining oil production and falling oil prices, but the government was unable to effectively address the situation. One of the major factors that worsened the situation was the state-run oil monopoly Petróleos de Venezuela S.A., PDVSA, which was plagued by epic graft schemes. These schemes involved the embezzlement of billions of dollars from the state-owned company, further crippling the country's already struggling economy. In addition to the ongoing economic problems, the population was also facing worsening shortages and black markets. Price controls implemented by the government led to shortages of essential goods as producers were unable to make a profit. This in turn gave rise to extortionate black markets, where prices for basic goods were significantly higher than those set by the government. Maduro's regime was also criticized for its lack of transparency, with human rights abuses, censorship, and repression becoming common features of the government. Political opposition was suppressed, and the media was controlled to prevent any critical reporting on the government's policies and actions. Despite these, Nicolas Maduro remained in power, using his authoritarian regime to maintain control and suppressing any opposition. The situation in Venezuela continued to deteriorate, with the population facing increased poverty, food insecurity, and a lack of access to basic necessities. The country's political and economic crisis deepened, and it remains one of the most complex and challenging situations in the world today. The economy has been severely impacted with hyperinflation, shortages of basic goods, and a lack of access to medical supplies. This situation has led to a large number of Venezuelans leaving the country in search of better opportunities and a better standard of living. In response to the crisis, Juan Guaido, the leader of the opposition, declared himself interim president in January 2019. With the support of several countries, including the United States. Despite initial international support, Guaido's efforts to create a transitional government have been unsuccessful, and Nicolas Maduro continues to control the country's state institutions. The international community has been divided in its support for the two leaders, with some countries recognizing Guaido as the legitimate president and others recognizing Nicolas Maduro. The European Union has stopped recognizing Guaido as president, but still does not recognize Nicolas Maduro as the legitimate president. In December 2022, 3 of the main opposition political parties in Venezuela backed a reform to dissolve the interim government and create a commission to manage foreign assets. The goal is to present a united strategy ahead of the presidential elections scheduled for 2024. The economic and political crisis in Venezuela has had a significant impact on the country and its people, and a resolution to the situation remains elusive. The international community and the citizens of Venezuela will continue to closely monitor the situation, hoping for a peaceful and democratic resolution to the crisis.